So here I'm back at the beginning of the exhibition of women, and it's called Essere Being a Woman is basically what this exhibit is called, and it talks about like what it meant to be a woman in ancient Pompeii, and that there were many different ranks of women. And this whole exhibit, this is the second part of, actually I would call this video 3 unless I combine them. Because the video ran out after 10 minutes. So that's why I had to start over. But basically, there were all categories of women were documented here. They're called matrons, which were the women, the married women that had children. There were freed women, and freed women were women who were once slaves and they became free. And many of these free women, which I'm going to share with you in the next video about one of them who became wealthy entrepreneur. Women who owned businesses here. There were slaves and all family roles, wife, daughters, concubines. So concubines were couples who lived together and weren't married, and all stages of life: birth, childhood, marriage, motherhood, and death. And what was fascinating to me, and as we go inside, is the the aspect of virginity that a woman would wear the night of her wedding. For example, she would wear a uh, like a light dress with a belt that had what was called a Hercules knot. And what a Hercules knot was to show that she was pure and a virgin. So what's very interesting is the fact, to me, is the fact that this whole aspect of virginity that we hear about with in Catholicism and the Christian faith of the Blessed Mother being a virgin and having baby Jesus, for example, that this whole philosophy of virginity existed before Christianity. So it was existing here, and women were expected to be virgins. Now, when they got married. Now, when I Googled about were men expected to be virgins too? Absolutely not, which I just find so interesting. Like, God, it's just so interesting. And the depictions in Naples, for example, when I was in Naples at the Archaeological Museum, and the statues of women who were naked, for example, covering their breasts, covering their genitals as a sign of what they said modesty, but to me it looked like shame, unless there was one caveat to that. And the caveat, if they were in a sensual position, in a position of sexuality, is where the women had confidence. Now, men who were naked, statues of naked men called heroic statues. In fact, of emperors, there were heroic statues of emperors, as well as dressed statues of emperors at this museum. It was the Naples Archaeological Museum. The men were integrated, meaning there was no shame, naked or dressed. Where women, that was already existing, that women's sexuality was to be hidden. Is that what led us to sexual problems today? And nearly half of women having difficulty having orgasm with men during sex, because gay couples, two women, do not have as much of this orgasm problem issue or sexual issues as women who are partnered with men. So, when we talk about the roots of sexual issues, it's one of the reasons I'm here, is to kind of uncover that. Now, we do know that men had erection issues in ancient Rome. That's another story for me to do at one point, but these issues with erections was existing in that time. So let's take a walk inside and give you a little more about the life. And there's one more thing I want to tell you about that is, I was a little blown away by this. That the father, there was a very patriarchal society. Like, I mean, it wasn't, even though women were allowed to be free and to be entrepreneurial and business life, it was still very structured. And when I mentioned about the concubines, for example, that a couple could not marry if they were not of the same status. So a concubine relationship where there was a habitation, cohabiting of a man and a woman, for example, that happened when they were of different classes. They weren't allowed to marry, so they could exist, cohabituate, I think it's called. Um, but the man of the household, in the married couple, would decide when the woman had a baby, and birth was one of the most dangerous times for a woman because there was no, hospitals and things like that where women could be. There was infections and hemorrhages during childbirth, so birth was a very dangerous time for a woman. But when she gave birth, the man of the house, they would put the baby down on the ground, and the man would decide: are we going to keep this baby, or are we not going to keep this baby? And if they decided they weren't going to keep the child, then they either left it where they left it, they took it outside. If the baby it might have died from starvation. Somebody might have picked it up and it went into a slave trade. So, obviously not right away, being that it was an infant, but it was raised as a slave. So that was a very shocking discovery about uh, fatherhood, So I'm glad we don't do that today, right? I'm glad we don't do that. All right, let's go take a look. We've got 4 more minutes on this particular video before we're going to have to end it. Okay. This was a matron, a woman, this by her dress and what she's wearing. So she was the woman of the house. She was in charge of all the finances with her partner, her husband. This was a statue of a child of a wealthy elite family. And when just some frescoes, some actual images of women. This is a reconstructed cradle, but babies were put in little cradles just like they do today. It looks like this is, I'm not sure what this piece of equipment is. Looks like it's for childbirth. Doesn't look like much fun, right? It does. It's a speculum number 1. Yep. It says, there it is. And motherhood. This was the positive outcome of birth was to be responsibility of the midwives. Okay, so they were like the doctors who had the practice of giving birth to the children. And just this whole section is all devoted to women. And this is very interesting. Look at the housewares. I mean, this was in 79 AD. The silver, the service for the table, very similar to how we eat and drink today. I mean, obviously we might not be drinking out of silver cups, but we're still drinking tables. And here it looks like where they would put a candle. Yeah, a candle for putting a candle. So very similar. Here's depicting a banquet. Now, what was different about banquets in Roman times is women were allowed to be there. In Greeks, women were not allowed to be at banquets. So that was one, women had been forbidden. The Greek women were forbidden to enter banquets, while here in Rome, women were allowed to be in banquets, which was, I thought, very, very interesting. And then we'll come to the jewelry. Jewelry very similar to what we see today. In fact, beautiful. Earrings. Imagine all of this was just covered up with ash, with lava. Beautiful, beautiful bracelets. Now this is, interestingly, you might see on this, there is it's an act of sex. And this whole section was about prostitution of women wearing jewels. And prostitution was not only with women, it was with boys. Something that we would find completely unacceptable in our society, at least in our society. I'm not saying that's for all societies, but the society that I'm familiar with in the United States and Europe would not.